So we're going to be talking about The Glass Menagerie by Tennessee Williams. It was first written in 1944, but it's set in the 30s. And before we get into this, I just want to say I tend to mispronounce menagerie. It is pronounced menagerie. If I say it a different way, ignore that. That's just me mispronouncing it. So let's get into some background on the play. So you need to understand a concept in literary theory to kind of understand how people talk about Williamson's work. So, when it comes to analyzing literature, we have a theory called death of the author. So, it used to be before kind of the 1980s that the way people would do literary criticism is they would try to find out everything they could about the author, and then they would try to kind of map out the author's personal life onto the works, basically psychoanalyzing the author to try to understand the author's exact intent. And in the 80s, we kind of started to move away from that. So death of the author basically means that once an author has published a work, they might as well be dead to it. They don't have absolute authority over what that work means. So it means the author's intention doesn't fully determine the meaning of the work. Why do we do this? For one, it's impractical. We're never going to 100% know exactly what the author intended, especially with older works. If we could only interpret Jane Austen's work, by knowing exactly what Jane Austen intended, we would never be able to understand what Pride and Prejudice meant because we're never going to 100% know what Jane Austen meant. Second, it ignores the unconscious and intentional process of writing. If you know anyone who writes, you know that there are things that slip in unconsciously or unintentionally that aren't meant. This is very common in the writing process. Oftentimes people start out with one thing, they change details. So trying to act like the author's intent is kind of the absolute end-all be-all of interpretation kind of just ignores how the writing process works. And lastly, it ignores the audience response. So one of the things that makes literature such an interesting medium is that you don't really have absolute objective knowledge. Different people are going to understand it different ways because of their life experience, especially in a medium like theater, where you literally have actors and directors making artistic choices that the author might not have dreamed of. So when it comes to analyzing literature, we do consider the author's intent to some extent, but in modern interpretation, we typically don't rely on that too much. The exception to this is The Glass Menagerie. A lot of people read this as a very autobiographical work for a few reasons. One is because Tennessee Williams is a stage name. His real name was Tom, and he named his main character Tom. The play is all about memory, which of course kind of invites you to read this as Tom's memory. And the other really important thing is the relationship between Tom in the play and his sister Laura. So Laura in the play is a character who has some kind of undefined disability. We know that she has a limp, so she has some kind of physical disability. And we know that there is something happening mentally, but it's never quite stated. We know she has really extreme anxiety. We know that she doesn't do well in social situations. And what Tennessee Williams is going to tell us in his kind of script notes is that she's someone who's not really in touch with reality. We'll come back to that idea later. Well, in real life, Tennessee Williams had a sister who, at the time, was diagnosed as schizophrenic. Now, we believe that she was really autistic. Autism was not a known thing in the 40s, and a lot of people who were diagnosed as schizophrenic today would be considered autistic. And when we look at the symptoms that his sister had, they tend to be symptoms that we associate with autism today. So she would hyperfixate on things, she had a lot of sensory issues, she didn't quite know what was socially appropriate and inappropriate to talk about. And we can see a lot of these symptoms kind of mapped onto Laura. What Tennessee Williams kind of considers her being out of touch with reality, her fixation on her little glass figurines, we would today see as a hyperfixation or special interest. We can see some of Laura's social awkwardness, that she doesn't really fit in with other people, that she doesn't really seem to be interested in fitting in with other people. And so Tennessee Williams' sister, she was eventually admitted into a mental institution, and she was lobotomized. And this is something that Tennessee Williams really regretted. He was not aware the procedure was going to happen till after it already happened. And he had a lot of regret that he wasn't able to protect his sister from what he saw as a really barbaric, horrific surgery. And you can see some of this regret kind of reflected in the character of Laura. In the story, Tom has essentially abandoned Laura, right? He has left to pursue his own happiness, and he doesn't really know what's become of Laura without him. And so a lot of people read these anxieties Tennessee Williams had in his own relationship with his sister, mapped onto Laura and her relationship with Tom. The other really important thing to know about Tennessee Williams is that he was a gay man in a time where that really was not socially acceptable at all. Being gay was still classified as a mental illness. And so what we're going to see in a lot of his works are anxieties about relationships. Sometimes he will have characters who are kind of openly gay. I say openly. They're closeted in the play, but it's made very explicit that they are gay. And a lot of people read Tom as a closeted gay character. And kind of the hint we get, besides just the fact that Tom shares Tennessee Williams' name and that Tennessee Williams himself was gay, is the fact that Tom keeps sneaking off to go to the movies. And his mom is going to confront him, where are you going at all times of night? And Tom is just going to say, to the movies. And his mom isn't going to straight up accuse him of doing other things, but what she's basically going to say is that doesn't make sense. People don't go to the movies every single night for hours at a time. So the implication is that Tom is probably going to maybe gay bars or gay clubs or some kind of secret underground society that he would not want his mom to know about. And so if you read scholarship on the Glass Menagerie, that's something that you might see pop up, is questions about Tom's sexuality. So this is a play that if you read the scholarship, people are going to be talking about Tennessee Williams' life a lot. And I don't want you to think that's necessarily the norm for how we talk about literature. It's a way that we can talk about literature, but it's a way that we kind of tend to push away from. This play is kind of an exception, simply because the way Tennessee Williams wrote it calls into question that he wants us to read it like an autobiography. So with that out of the way, let's just kind of go over the summary of what happens in the play. So the play begins with the character Tom telling us that the events of the play have already happened. So everything we're about to see has happened in the past, and we're viewing it through his memory. And this is something really important when it comes to analyzing this play, because for one, we all know that memory is imperfect, right? So what we're seeing is not what really happened, it's what Tom remembers happening. Second, if you pay close attention, there's a lot of the play that Tom wasn't actually physically present for. So Laura and Jim's conversation, Tom would not have physically seen. So his memory is essentially filling in the blanks of what he thinks happened. So we never really get to see Laura as herself. We see Laura as Tom thinks Laura acted. So this older Tom has left his family, and he's now remembering everything that led up to that decision. And we are then transported through the past through his memory. So we're transported back to the 30s. The Wingfield family live in poverty. Having been abandoned by her husband, Amanda, the mother, was forced to raise her children on a single income. And let's just remember, this is a time period where women really weren't expected to work, and there wasn't a lot of available jobs for them. So it wasn't just raising a child on a single income, it was a single woman's income, which would have been significantly less than a single man's income. And so she now relies heavily on her adult son Tom to help provide for the family, especially for her disabled daughter Laura, who doesn't seem to be able to provide for herself. So as I mentioned earlier, Laura's exact disability is not quite specified. She seems to have both a physical and a mental disability, which I'm using the term disability very, very loosely. If you study disability scholarship, I kind of talked about this with Harvey. We tend to use the term disability to kind of encompass learning disabilities, mental disorders, physical disorders. So that's a term I'm using very loosely. So Laura has dropped out of typing school due to her anxiety. She got so anxious she just couldn't go. and she pretended to go while really just wandering around town. And so Amanda has decided that the only way to secure Laura's future is through marriage. She's tried to get her educated, she's tried to get her to do kind of like the typical girls' jobs that were available. That hasn't worked out. So now Amanda thinks the only way to have Laura live securely is to marry her to someone who will take care of her. And so she convinces Tom to bring home a potential suitor for Laura, and he brings home his friend Jim. And Jim is actually Laura's former high school crush. They went to high school together, so she knows him. She already very much is kind of infatuated with him. And they seem to hit it off, only for Jim to reveal that he's engaged. And as the play ends, we never really know what becomes of Laura and Amanda after Tom left. But it's really heavily implied that this was kind of Laura's last chance to find security. That once Jim leaves, she's never going to find a husband or a secure way of life. So let's talk about some of the kind of critiques and themes that are going on. This play very much critiques the failure of the American dream and modern society on multiple levels. So first, we kind of have just the drudgery of modern life. So Tom is a poet. He's a very artistic person, but he has to work in this factory to support his family that doesn't feed the soul. Yeah, this autocorrected to wood, it should say it doesn't feed the soul. So the idea that to fit into the American dream kind of modern society that makes you constantly work for a living, you have to kind of sacrifice the artistic parts of yourself because they're not going to support your family. And next is the lack of protections for those who can't fit the social mold. So something I'm going to address a little bit later is the way in which Laura and her disability become a symbol for a lot of societal problems. And this is really symbolized through Laura's glass collection. So Laura's favorite figurine is a unicorn. And Jim accidentally breaks its horn off. Now the horn is the thing that makes the unicorn special, right? It's what separates it from all the other horses. But as long as it has that horn, it also can't fit into society. Laura even makes a comment that maybe it's a good thing its horn got broken off, because now it fits in with all the other horses. So one of the problems with kind of this modern American dream capitalism going on is that if you don't fit into this system, we don't really have a way to protect you. Laura can't really fit in with modern life. She can't do the jobs expected of her, she can't seem to go to school, she can't seem to marry, which would be the other option for women. So what's left to her? How is she supposed to adapt and fit in if the world is not willing to bend to accept her unique perspectives on life? And next is the instability of a nuclear family. So the 30s and 40s are a time where the nuclear family is some kind of like, it's basically an icon that people buy into. The idea is that to have a successful life, you get married, you have the 2.5 kids, you have the white picket fence, and Tennessee Williams is going to really critique the idea of the nuclear family as this stable unit that is going to help everybody. So remember, Tom and Laura already come from a broken family, right? Their father has abandoned them, and that has left the family in dire straits. So we already see the idea that the nuclear family is not kind of this stable thing that is going to protect everybody, but Amanda can't stop believing in it. So despite the fact that her marriage arguably left her in a worse situation with 2 children to support, she clings to this dream. She thinks that this is what's going to help out Laura. And so Sarah Ahmed has this theory called happy objects. And happy objects are the things that we cling to, thinking they will bring us happiness, regardless of whether or not that's really true. And so marriage is an example of this. Amanda has this idea that marriage is going to bring Laura stability, that marriage will make sure she's taken care of, despite the fact that her own marriage did not take care of her or bring her stability. And we see this reflected again through the fact that Jim kisses Laura, and he seems to think that giving her this kiss, this kind of magical experience of adulthood, is somehow going to fix her. And if you think about common European fairy tales, kisses often have this transformative potential, right? You wake the sleeping princess with a kiss. True love's first kiss transforms people. Because kisses are basically the signifier of going from childhood to adulthood. And this doesn't work for Laura, right? This magical kiss, this signifier of entering into the adult marriage world, the nuclear family, it does nothing for her. It's not going to work. And so let's talk about some disability studies critiques. So there are two main ones. First is examining the way that the play uses disability as a metaphor. So I'm going to have you guys read an article written by David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder called Narrative Prothesis. So a prothesis is essentially an artificial limb or body part. And so what they're going to look at is how literature often uses disability to signify some larger idea. That narrative kind of relies on disability as a symbol oftentimes. And so, as I said, we see this through Laura. Laura's disability comes to embody everything the play wants to critique about the modern world, right? That her unique perspective cannot be allowed to exist. That she does not fit into the modern world, and there's no protections for her. And even this idea that Tom's role in the family is supposed to be to take care of Laura, but at the same time, it's kind of sucking the life out of him, and he feels that he has to leave Laura to discover something for himself. Yet he comes to regret that decision and constantly thinks about her. And we see disability used as a metaphor from the very beginning of the play. So before we get into the past section, when Tom is still kind of narrating, here's what's happening. He tells us, I reverse it to that quaint period, the 30s, so we're going to go back in time to the 30s, when the huge middle class of America was matriculating in a school for the blind. Their eyes had failed them, or they had failed their eyes, and so they were having their fingers pressed forcibly onto the fiery braille alphabet of a dissolving economy. So Williams is using the metaphor of blindness to talk about what was happening in the American economy at this time. Basically the idea that Americans were so blinded by all these promises of the American dream and what it takes to work hard in the nuclear family, that they were blinded to the fact that the system was not working. It was failing a bunch of people. A lot of people were struggling to survive, but they were having their hands forcibly pressed onto that fiery braille alphabet of the dissolving economy.